Return of the Exiled, or Why Must I Be the Hero? By T.J. Stegaheis. Read by Yob. Dedicated to Kurt Reimert, whose stories inspired this work. Requiescat in pace. Chapter 15. Goblin Swamp. After 4 days of haste, Sard decided that they could slow down and focus on following Tanner's clues to the next goal. To Goblin Swamp I lead you now. Take Western Road by horse. Clearly they were heading into Goblin country, and at a very bad time of year, too. The close of summer was when the goblins most liked to raid the human settlements, and would be building themselves up to launch attacks on the local farming communities. They could hardly be more dangerous than now. Once across the river, they would have to be extra vigilant and ready to defend themselves. The woodlands were beginning to thin out, and open fields and farms dominated the land. As they neared the river Thenagor, as the road turned south and at the river, they would have to maintain a course due west to reach the swamp where the clues said they should. By now, Smoke was mostly recovered from his encounter with the Baron Gettelfor. He and Cilio and Filio usually scouted ahead. Sard took up covering the rear with the men-at-arms, while Bud, Frog, and Riff stayed as close to Windy as they could. They re-outfitted the horses as pack animals to be less conspicuous. They passed 3 caravans going east. All reported that the road was clear, for now. They reached the river at a well-populated farming town called Edgertown. Sturdy guard towers rose above the town wall, each holding 2 lookouts with bows. Town guardsmen patrolled the wall walk, also armed. The townspeople went out of their way to encourage them to turn back. An innkeeper named Yob invited them all to a nice dinner, for the sole purpose of telling them how crazy they would be to cross the river just now. Then there was the incident at the inn. With the local farmers all barricaded into their farmsteads, the local laborers had nothing to do but sit in the inn and drink. One young fellow took a liking to Wendy and made some rude comments about her. She tried to ignore him, but he continued. As she continued to look away from him, he got louder, and finally, he called her a whore. The next thing Windy knew, she was being held back off the youth by Sard and Bud. The young man lay prone on the floor, staring up at her with terror in his eyes. With a shake, Bud forced her to drop the knife. She did not recall drawing. "Never say that to a fighting woman," advised Sard to the man. The youth scrambled away and fled out of the door. "I'm a monster," wept Windy quietly to Bud. "No," said Bud, "but that temper will be your undoing if you cannot control it." They sat back down with Windy concealed between Bud and Riff. "I hope that it will not hold this against us as they did in Glenfrey," whispered Sard. "We still need food and a ride across the river." "I could have killed him just like," whispered Windy. "But you didn't," said Bud quietly. While a few locals were staring at them, most returned to their meals and ale. Sard expressed his hopes that they would soon forget the matter. Fortunately, they were able to resupply and cross the river by ferry, the stoic ferryman looking them over suspiciously. The land was flat, open, with scattered isolated hillocks topped with stands of bushy trees. The first day was uneventful. The second day they spotted a line of goblins heading south and concealed themselves behind a hillock to watch them go. On the third day it began to rain, and they were slowed. The following day the rain was a downpour, and they were stuck in their wet and miserable camp. By the 5th day in the territory between the swamp and the river, the going was very slow, as the ground had become soggy and muddy. Sard decided to find a good place to camp above the mud and let the land dry out. Unfortunately, a group of goblins had the same idea, and the hillock with its stand of trees was the prize they fought over. Sard felt it was important that no goblins escape to inform the others, and they killed all 8 of them, taking only minor wounds themselves. They won the hillock and made camp. Canvas was stretched between several trees, and a small smokeless fire was made, as they settled down to wait for drier travel. Twice they moved the goblins' corpses to get them further away from the camp. The stench was just terrible. Wendy studied the corpses, as she had not gotten a good look at the goblins Baron Gettelfor had brought with him. They were nasty-looking creatures, about the same height as gnomes, mottled brown or greenish skin, protruding lower jaws, with tiny noses and bulging eyes. Their hair was like brown or green scabs, and the odor was indescribably foul. The day was dreary and damp. Later, by the fire, Wendy examined her arm and the slight scar left from a goblin sword. Hafted assured her that it would fade away in time. The lightning scars on her arms, however, refused to fade away. They passed the time discussing what the return of Prince Frederick to the throne of Tor would mean to the other kingdoms. Bud said that he hoped to get to serve Prince Frederick once he was restored as king. He could then dedicate himself without hesitation. Riff just wanted a cottage where he could make a small living, gathering wood and making charcoal. Sard said he wanted a chance to prove himself so that people would never doubt him again. The other men followed Sard's lead and said that they would serve whomever believed in them. For the first time, Sard mentioned his father, Captain Cullen of the ship Lady of the Foam. He had never known his mother, as she had died when he was a babe. Sard would have been a sailor like his father, except that being at sea for more than a few hours always made him ill. Tennard was frustrated that his magical circles to contact the college were not getting through. Waiting was bringing out homesickness in all of them. They grew impatient with the wait and stayed only 3 days before packing up and setting out again. The ground had firmed up somewhat, and by avoiding the very wet areas, they set a fair pace. Dram used a magical needle which would show him the way due north, and from that he could find due west. The clumps of trees grew a little closer in and in larger clumps. 4 days later, in a thick mist, they drew near to the swamp itself. Then the goblins attacked in far greater numbers. Headed up by a remarkably large goblin with a hideously scarred face, the goblins attacked near evening. They quickly forced the group into a difficult position, as there was no nearby cover. Bud and Riff stood with Wendy, and with their 3 backs together, they made their stand. Nearby, Tennard, Frog, and the gnomes were using a dead horse for cover and giving the goblins a major magical headache. Sard and the other fighting men had been separated from Wendy and Tennard, but they were giving a good accounting of themselves by the sounds of the goblin cries. Tanner and his group were on the other side of a wall of high grass, and they could be heard shouting amid the clashing with the goblins. The screech of goblins, the shouting of men, and the clang of steel made for a deafening noise. Wendy was hard put to keep up with so many goblins. They seemed to be everywhere, and they slashed and stabbed without hesitation. Wendy would block one, use her knife to parry another, while shifting her stance to avoid the occasional wild thrust from additional goblins. She managed to slay quite a few, but they kept coming. There seemed to be no end of them. One ugly brute kept trying to hook her feet until she finally got a clean slice at him, splitting an ear and ruining one eye, so he fled. Blood was trickling down one of her legs, but there was no time to worry about it. Wendy was suddenly aware that the back that she was pressing against was different. Someone with a narrower waist and not as tall as either Bud or Riff was behind her. Finally, the goblins, having taken heavy losses, retreated. She turned and saw the face of a stranger, a slender man with long blonde hair and twin swords. She looked past him and immediately called for Hefted. Bud had been hacked into pieces and was dead. Riff's armor had been pulled open and his abdomen torn apart. The big man was fading fast. Hefted came running, but it was too late. Riff died with Wendy holding his large hand. Poor Riff. He had always been faithful, never complained. Bud was smart, dependable, and been Sard's second in command. Wendy would miss them both. Tears began to well up in her eyes. She was once again a young farm girl, ready to cry. Sard came running up in response to hear the shouts and slowed when he saw who was down. Upon learning that they were both dead, he cursed quietly and turned away for a moment. Then he turned back, his face expressionless, and addressed the group as the other men caught up and gathered round. "We lost a soldier named Hearn from Sersha. King Buford will no doubt send a company to reclaim his body. Here we lost two of our first and best. They have no one waiting for them back home, so let us bury them here at the site of their victory." "Victory?" inquired Wendy. "Yes, victory. They told me that they planned to do whatever it took to keep you safe. They succeeded. That is a victory to a soldier. They will rest here, and I have no doubt that their spirits will defend those who pass this way," Sard replied. He paused to regain his composure, then looked at the stranger and suddenly burst out, "Leo? Is it you?" "You may call me Leo," said the stranger with a wonderfully rich voice, "or you may call me Arundel. I grieve for your loss. They fought well and died with honor." Hefted was busy healing several wounded men. Tenor twice tried to say something, but gave up. Even the gnomes wept. "I liked them. They knew how to take a joke," said Cilio. "They were good fellows for humans," added Filio. Smoke just stood silent, his face showing his grief. Midgie was found hiding in a badger hole, shaken but unharmed. The horses were all gone, 2 dead, and the rest either taken or driven off by the goblins. They managed to recover some of their supplies. They would need food soon. Neither Wendy nor Tennard could identify edible plants here, and the few they tried tasted like the swamp smelled. Now they missed Sabrina and her ability to find wild edibles. So the next morning, under cloud-laden skies, they dug graves for 2 friends. A 3rd grave would hold Tern, the Circean soldier, until his people could reclaim him. Their friends wrapped in blankets, and they set them gently into the earth. They each turned at the grave to say what they could. Wendy wanted to say something profound, but she could not find her voice. Sard told of their several battles together and the escape from Miston City dungeon. All of them were somber. They were remembering 2 tall men who had been reliable companions and powerful allies, who would not be with them anymore. This was not a good day, and this was not what they thought of as adventure. Arundel, or Leo, or whoever he was, seemed to sincerely share their grief, while at the same time seemed to remain rather distant and aloof. Wendy asked herself if she had even thanked Bud or Riff for the many kindnesses they had done her. She remembered their embarrassment when Sard had them form a blind for her when there was no cover for her private needs. As she was unable to remember if she had always said her thanks to them, she vowed she would always try to give the men her proper thanks. Clearly, one could never know when the chance to say one's thanks might be the last. Now that there was time to look around, they spotted something unseen in the mist and the heat of battle. A spur of rock some 40 feet high, rising alone out of the stunted growth just ahead of them in the misty morning light, its top cleft into 2 branches, between which a crudely carven wooden idol had been fitted. Find the high fork, exalted so, and northward set your course." They had found the next marker. From here they would travel north. More from Arundel. "If only they would head south to Luffa, they would be safe and I could relax." So of course they headed right into the heart of Goblin Country, right to the Great Swamp. How do they do it? The worst possible places, and they not only survive, they do great works. So I followed more closely this time. They do fine for the first few days, and then they blunder right into the holy sanctuary of the Goblin faithful. Yes, they worship some slimy goblin deity, but they will defend that deity viciously, and they did. When it looked certain that they would be overwhelmed, I knew I had to do something. I'd never be able to convince goblins to give to me what they were carrying, so I put my back to that of the girl with all the surprises and helped them survive. They still lost 3 good soldiers. They finally drove off the goblin witch doctor and his army. Now I would have to introduce myself to them and journey with them. But do you know, for humans, this group is not bad. I could, in fact, get to like some of them. Do not tell my father I said that. If I must consort with humans, it is good to know that there seem to be better humans with whom to consort. I still had not revealed my race to them. They dealt with me honorably and seemed like intelligent and responsible people. I may travel with them for some time, if this proves to be their normal behavior. They had a little fuzzle with them. They said that they had rescued her from some Grolls who had her trapped. The Grolls were probably after her for her fur, as good fuzzle fur is a valuable luxury in Groll culture. Like all fuzzles, she was seldom quiet. I was glad to leave the reek of dead goblins behind.